Let's do a quick review of what's included in the kit for the MGW Corvette lower billet box assembly. We have the upper and lower half of the billet box itself. We have the two support bushings that assemble into the billet box like that, and just snaps together like that. We have the 4/4 20 grade 8 bolts. We have a packet of blue Loctite. We have a sheet of Dynamax Extreme, and we have 3 heat shield barriers, 2 rectangular pieces and 1 T-shaped piece, and we'll explain how those are installed when we get into the installation part. Okay, we're going to show how to assemble the MGW lower billet shifter box using the linkage rod that's in your factory OEM box. So we need to remove this item from the factory cast box by removing these 2 Phillips head screws. Okay, once the screws are out, you just wiggle this back plastic piece and it should pull out the entire rod out of the factory box, and then slide the plastic end off. Now, before you install this linkage rod into the MGW billet box, just inspect the surface of the ground shaft on the front and the back of the pivot cup just to make sure that it's smooth, it doesn't have any burrs on it or anything, and if it does, just sand it lightly with some very, very fine sandpaper or steel wool. It has to remain a very smooth finish because you do not want it to wear out the bushings in the MGW box. So what we'll do now is we'll slide the MGW bushings on the front and back, and then we'll take the top half, and it is obviously important which side you put it in, so you orient this thing by flipping it over just like this, and you're going to want to have the end that has the notch out on the right side, and then just position the little bushings inside the half moon cutouts just like that. Make sure it slides back and forth, and then you want to take the bottom half and just flip it over, and it obviously is machined not symmetrical, so you have to install it the proper way so the bolts line up and the grooves line up, and just push it down. Once you push it in place, again, make sure that the rod slides freely, and then take the 4 provided 1/4 20 lock screws and clamp the 2 halves of the clamshell together. Now make sure that when you clamp this, you do not tighten one screw all the way. You want to do it just like you would put a wheel on a car. Get this one close to snug and then go in a diagonal pattern. And this box is designed that you want to tighten these screws firmly because it will tighten metal on metal. It will not pinch the bushings. It only traps them. So go ahead and tighten these things very, very tightly. And then once you get all of them close to snug, then you can go ahead and go around again in a diagonal pattern and tighten them very tightly. Just make sure that when you do that, that you have these bushings seated properly. You do not want to crush the rubber inside the bushings, and the shaft should slide freely, not feel any bind. But as you can see, there's no play in it. It's trapped very precisely. All right, and that's how you assemble the shifter box. The first step to install the MGW lower billet box is to install the Dynamax Extreme and the heat shields. The first step is the large sheet that you got in the kit. You want to trim 2 pieces that are 4 inches by 5 inches rectangles, 2 pieces of them. You take the adhesive backing off the first piece, and with the 4-inch width, the thinner width, you actually want to put it right in between the 2 mounting pads. Slide it back as far as you can there, and then you actually want to let it wrap around the little post that's on the torque tube. Every C5 and C6 has that little notch. And you reach back and just make sure that you push it down flat. Be very careful, do not run your fingers across the edges of this aluminum backing plate. It will cut you just like a paper cut really badly. So just push it down and slide in perpendicular with the material. Okay, you'll take the second sheet of 4" by 5" Dynamax Extreme, and you want to take this exact opposite. You want to take it by the 5" width instead of the 4". And carefully, because it's very sticky, reach one hand and go all the way up underneath the torque tube, as far down as you can get. And you do not want that sheet to overlap this sheet. In the front is okay, just the way I have it, but do not have it overlap the top. It'll be too thick. And then reach your hands again, being very careful not to cut yourself on the edges of that aluminum backing material, and just push it against the torque tube. The next step is to take one of the rectangular heat barrier sheets and again peel off the adhesive backing. And be very careful because it's also sticky, and you want to carefully slide it in. Just pull it away from it, and you want to mount it right up against the side wall and press it down flat, just like that. Do not let it come over top. As a matter of fact, I would prefer it to be a little lower than this, but this is fine, but maybe about a 1/2 inch below this surface would be perfect. Just make sure it sticks nicely to the surface, like that. Now take the second rectangular heat shield material, peel off the backing, and you want to carefully slide this piece in, move the little linkage rod out of the way. The adhesive should be facing the passenger side because we're going to slide this down as far as we can get it. And we are going to try to get it all the way down inside there. And we are going to stick it to the torque tube like this. Get it down a little bit farther. And again, we want to have it flush with this tab. Do not have it flapping over this tab. You just want to lay it like that. It doesn't matter if it crumples a little bit. It's just fine. This is just heat shield area. Keeps some of the heat coming up, radiating up from the exhaust area up into the shifter area. So you just stick that like that, and that should be good. Now the final piece is the T-shaped piece of heat shield barrier. Peel off the backing carefully on it as well. And you want to position this adhesive down, and the wide part will go right at the bottom, and you'll want to lay it right on top of that notch out we talked about, and then work the thin part right in between the two posts where the shifter box mounts, and just press it down. Make sure you press it firmly so that it stays in place. And there you go. Okay, we're ready to mount the lower box onto the vehicle. Before you do that, you want to take the super lube and just apply a little bit of the grease in the front and back of the pivot cup, and just slide it back and forth a few times to let the grease get inside the bushing. Then you want to orient it so that the little notch on the center linkage rod, that little notch cutout, is facing the driver's side. You want to reach down and grab the linkage rod going back to the transmission and slide that rod onto the MGW box, and then you want to carefully work it in. Be very careful, don't let the rod fall out of the linkage rod, just like that. It's a tight fit, but it will go in, and get it in there as such. And then we're going to line up the three pieces. Now, one of the things you need to do is, as you can see, there's a little mounting hole. That's actually the position alignment pin hole for the stock box, which we don't use that pin, but you can easily keep that thing aligned. And if you look through this hole carefully, you may not be able to see it in the camera, but you'll be able to see if you look carefully. Even if you shine a flashlight in there, you'll see the half notch go in. So you take one of the Torx bolts that you took off, and you apply a little bit of the blue Loctite to the threads, and you want to slide that in until you feel it line up inside that notch cutout, and then run that rod down. Then using your number 40 Torx, go ahead and get that screw started in there. Now before you tighten that completely, you want to make sure, as you can see, even with that thing in the notch cutout, you can slide the rod rotationally a little bit. You just want to make sure that that little hole is aligned at 12 o'clock. And you can just do it by eye. It's not that critical. You just make sure that it's pretty much straight up and down. Just like that. You can see it right along the center line. You don't want it like this. You don't want it like that. You just want it right up at 12. Then go ahead and tighten up. It's very important to get this bolt extremely tight. You don't want to break the threads or strip them. So don't use anything more than this tool I have here. Don't use a long extension on a socket, but you want to get on it very tight. We've had some customers have issues where this slips and all of a sudden it's hard to get into reverse. So make sure it's very tight, just like that. Okay, once we have the linkage rod connected to the linkage cup in the lower box, we're ready to mount the box itself to the torque tube of the car. You take the other Torx bolts that you took off the OEM assembly, put the blue Loctite on them, slide them down inside each one, and take the number 40 Torx again and just get them both started. But do not tighten them. Just get them within about a 1/16 of being seated. Same thing with the other bolt here in the back. Alright, then once you get these seated, we'll show how to align the box. Okay, once you have the two Torx bolts fairly close to being seated but still loose so that you can slide the box back and forth, you just want to eyeball the pivot cup with the square hole cut out and just kind of get it. And another good point of reference is if you take that little hole we talked about on the pin and just split it and put the bushing right at the equator of that pinhole, you can also see that you have pretty much the same amount of rod showing here, and the pivot cup is visually centered inside the box. The nice thing about the MGW box, it is not nearly as sensitive as far as front to back location of the stock box is, because we have a lot more travel on that rod. But you want to get it close, and as you can see, it looks very close here. And again, as a good point of reference, that little pinhole is split right in half. So once you get that, you can hold it in place and go ahead and tighten down the two Torx bolts. Okay, once you have the box solidly mounted to the car, before you put the shifter on, go ahead and one more time just check the centering of the pivot cup. You want to push with your thumb all the way forward, and if you look down inside here, you'll see that we do have a gap where the white bushing is. Make sure it's not actually rubbing against the bushing. That'll ensure that it's completely engaged in gear. Same thing, slide it all the way back into 4th gear, and if you look down in there carefully, you can see that there's a little bit, maybe about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch gap there. If it looks like it's really, really close on one side and big gap on the other, loosen these two bolts, slide it a little bit, tighten it back up. Make sure that it's done now before you button everything up, cause you a lot less headaches.